So I tend to be a little bit of an over-explainer. Anybody else like that? You know anybody like that? Not my worst bad habit, but it is certainly one of the more annoying ones, I think. And I know why I do it. At heart, I'm a teacher. I get so much joy from just learning things and then helping other people understand it for the first time. When you see the dots connect for somebody in a brand new way, I can't. It doesn't get better than that for me. Which means it's really frustrating when I feel like I can't find the right words to say or the right examples to help somebody kind of get to that breakthrough. And usually the way I deal with that frustration is just to keep talking. Keep using examples until the bitter end. In fact, one of the things I've started telling people when I sit down for coffee or spiritual direction or counseling or whatever is, hey, something you should know about me from the get-go. If you let me, I will overwhelm you with resources, with homework, with ideas. It's okay. If you want to tell me to chill out, to slow down, or stop, that's okay. I get it. I know me well enough now. And so for people like me, who tend to over-explain things, it's good to be reminded every once in a while that some things are just hard to explain. Some things actually defy explanation, don't they? And I think one of those things is experience. Let me give you a few examples. How do you really explain the experience of a great vacation to somebody? I can tell you where we went. I can show you pictures. I can give you our itinerary. Here's what we did. Here's what we ate. I can tell you how I felt afterwards, but I can't really give you a sense of what it was like to be on that vacation. The rest and renewal, I feel, is non-transferable, unfortunately. What about the experience of a great relationship? How do I really explain the experience of my marriage? I can tell you things about my wife, things that I appreciate, things that I think are unique, things that I think make our relationship what it is, and I could give you the best explanation in the world, but I can never give you a sense, or I can never give you the experience of what it's like to be us over a long period of time. Not really. And then what about this one? How can I possibly explain the experience of maturing in Jesus over a long period of time? I can tell you what I know. I can tell you how I learned it. I can tell you what I do and how I learned to do it. I can give you all of the ideas that mean something to me. I can give you all of the homework that's meant something to me. I can tell you about it all. And yet I can never transfer. I can never give you the experience of life with God over a long period of time. And my point is just this. You can never really explain experience. It's really hard. You can never really do that. Experience requires experience. And so that's the challenge before us today as we dive into our conversation. But before we try to tackle that challenge, it might be worth a moment of our time just to kind of frame this discussion within the series at large. So if you've been with us since the beginning of the year, you know we've been working through this critical journey series following this graphic. And we said that, listen, each of us, we're unique individuals. We have our own stories, our own lives as it unfolds. But because we've all been invited into life with the same true God, and because we are all being conformed into the image of Jesus, and because we are all indwelt by the same Spirit, our lives kind of tend to unfold along some pretty common patterns and trajectories. So we can learn from each other. We can gain wisdom from that. And so we've worked through these stages. Stage one is the recognition of God. At some point in your life, some point in my life, we all become aware of the opportunity to be in relationship with God through Jesus. And we say yes to that. And then for most of us, the very next thing that happens is we move into stage two, which is the life of discipleship, where we usually find a community, usually find maybe a church or whatever, people who can help us learn how to follow Jesus, and a place where we can find belonging with others who are on the same path that we are. And then we move into stage three. At some point, you spend enough time around this community, you learn enough things, and you become the kind of person who can contribute in that community, who can use your gifts, who can participate in the mission of the kingdom of God. And you just start saying yes to opportunities to do stuff like that. But then we got to stage four, and this is what we call the journey inward. This is a season marked usually by disorientation and a sense of disconnection or deep conflict in our life with God. And last week we talked about the wall. Somewhere at the end of stage four, we have this kind of face-to-face encounter, kind of showdown with God, where we are challenged and undone so that we can be put back together again and continue onward in the journey. And if you remember what we said last week, we said the disconnection that you and I feel when we are at the wall, it's meant to resolve in a deeper connection with God, with self, and with others. The deep conflict that we feel sometimes in life with God at the wall, it is meant to resolve in deeper roots and in a more fruitful life. The journey inward is meant to resolve in stage 5, the journey outward, which is where we are going to be today. But how exactly all of that happens and what exactly it looks like, that can be really hard to explain. There's a tension in any conversation about spiritual formation and discipleship. The further up you go, the more personal your journey becomes. After all, God is working through your life, your story, your circumstances, your relationships, your context, your interests and passions, the highs and lows of your life. God is doing something unique in your story for his kingdom. But not only that, the further in we go, the further into the life of the Trinity, the more mysterious this journey becomes. We are being transformed, but it's often happening slowly, over time, from the inside out, in ways that we just can't fully understand and appreciate, even in the moment. The authors of The Critical Journey put it this way. They say stage 5 is the outward journey. But how do you talk about what's going on at this stage in the journey? This becomes one of the dilemmas. The healing and calling experienced are so personal and profound that they are difficult to express. When we do talk about faith at this stage, we often use the same language, analogies, and images that we used at earlier stages, yet the language doesn't explain. It doesn't capture the surrender, the experience of our own personal, painful path to healing and wholeness in God, or our real sense of call. All of which is to say today, I'm going to do my very best not to give in to one of my deepest impulses, and that is to try and over-explain something that can only really be understood through experience over time. And so instead of just describing stage 5 to you today or giving you 3 simple steps so that you can go out here and become a stage 5 disciple by the end of the week, what I want to do instead is actually just hold up some portraits of people from Scripture that I think really embody life with God at this stage. And the idea here is not just to read their stories so we can go out and do what they did. Again, their life is not your life, their story is not your story. It is instead to gaze at these portraits so we can learn to see how they see, to think how they think, so that we can gain wisdom for our own life with God. So you ready? You ready? Okay, here we go. Portrait number 1 is Joseph. We're introduced to him in Genesis. His story is like 13 chapters long, so we don't have anything like the time to unpack it in detail. But fortunately, it's a pretty familiar story to a lot of us. And if not, here are the highlights. So when we are introduced to Joseph in Genesis 37, the first thing we're told about him is that he's a tattletale. He's like the worst person, right? Like, oh, is there anything worse than a tattletale? His early portrait is of an immature teen with delusions of grandeur. He is the 11th of 12 sons belonging to Jacob, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And something else you should know is that he's actually Jacob's favorite son, despite his birth order. And this has gone to his head in some ways. He regularly seems to have dreams in which he is ruling over his family and his brothers are all bowing down to him. And he has no problem bringing this up at dinner. He's just dumb. He's terrible, immature person. But one day, Joseph the tattler, Joseph the dreamer, is sent out to meet with his brothers who are far off tending their flocks away from home. And as the opportunity presents itself, as so often, the family tension just finally boils over. Brothers have had enough. They seize him, they fake his death, and they sell him into slavery. And Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, becomes Joseph, the property of a man named Potiphar. Against all the odds, though, Joseph gains the favor and respect of Potiphar and makes his way up in his household, only once again to be betrayed this time by Potiphar's wife. And this lands Joseph in prison. But it's while he's in prison that he meets one of his cellmates, who is a cupbearer of Pharaoh. And this cupbearer is having a dream that he can't quite understand. And so Joseph, he gives him help with that. And this conversation becomes the catalyst for Joseph to eventually find himself standing before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, helping him understand and interpret a confusing dream. And when Joseph has this opportunity, he looks Pharaoh in the eyes and he says, this dream you're having, it's pretty easy actually. It's a message from God. The next 7 years for you are going to be awesome. The land is going to produce, everything's going to go great. But then 7 years after that, there's going to be a great famine in the land. And then Joseph's wisdom and counsel helps Pharaoh figure out what to do with this dream that he's had. And Pharaoh says this to him: "Could we find a man like him, in whom is the Spirit of God? After God has made known to you all this, there is none as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and by your lips all my people shall be guided. By the throne alone shall I be greater than you. See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." So for the next 7 years, Joseph helps Egypt prepare for the coming famine. And eventually that famine comes. And it is a great famine. And it spreads not only throughout Egypt, but throughout all of the region, including Canaan, where Jacob's family dwells. And in utter desperation, Jacob sends all of his sons down to Egypt to get grain so that they won't die. And this is the occasion that brings Joseph face to face with his brothers for the first time in over a decade. Before we go on, let me just ask you the question. Imagine you're Joseph. You have been betrayed. The best years of your life have been stolen from you. You have been treated like property. And now here you are, standing before the very people who inflicted all of that on you, and you have all the power. What would you do? How would you respond to this situation? Genesis 45, we're told Joseph could no longer hold himself in check before all who stood attendance upon him, and he cried, "Clear out, everyone around me." And no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And as he wept aloud, and the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard, and Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed before him. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me, pray." And they came close, and he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold into Egypt. And now do not be pained, and do not be incensed with yourselves that you sold me down here, because for sustenance God has sent me before you. 2 years now there have been famine in the heart of the land, and there are yet 5 years without plowing and harvesting. And God has sent me before you to make a remnant on earth and to preserve life, for you to be a great surviving group. And so it is not you who sent me here, but God. And he made me father to Pharaoh and lord to all of his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord over all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay, and you shall dwell in the land of Goshen and shall be close to me. You and your sons and the sons of your sons and your flocks and your cattle and all that is yours, and I will sustain you there. For yet 5 years of famine remain, lest you lose all, you and your household and all that is yours.'" And that's exactly what happens. Joseph's brothers go and get Jacob. They bring him down. There's a big family reunion. It's an amazing moment. It's an amazing story. And it all kind of seems too good to be true, doesn't it? This is exactly what Joseph's brothers think. In Genesis chapter 50, we pick up the story. And Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. Jacob finally dies. And they said, "If Joseph bears resentment against us, he will surely pay us back for all the evil we caused him. He may have treated us kindly while Dad was alive, but now that Dad's gone, we're going to see Joseph as he really is. We're going to see what's really in there." And they charged Joseph, saying, your father left a charge before his death. Hey, we talked to Dad. You weren't there. You didn't hear this conversation. But Dad told us this. Thus you shall say to Joseph, we beseech you, forgive the crime and the offense of your brothers, for evil they have caused you. Forgive the crime of the servants of your father's God. And Joseph hears this, and he wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers came, and they flung themselves before him. And in a great irony, they said, here we are, your slaves. We sold you into slavery. Now we want to be your slaves. Is that the best we can do here? And then Joseph looks at them, and he says this, fear not, for am I instead of God? While you meant evil towards me, there's no doubt about it, God meant it for good, so as to bring it about at this very time, keeping many people alive. And so fear not. I will sustain you and your little ones. And he comforted them, and he spoke to their hearts. Joseph the tattletale has become Joseph the rescuing ally. The teen who used to dream of ruling over his family now sees himself as a servant and as a sustainer, not just for his family, but for everybody. It's amazing. Centuries on from the life of Joseph, Israel would once again find themselves needing a rescuing ally in a place far from home. In this case, Israel has been exiled. They have been taken captive by Babylon, and then they have been taken captive by the people who conquered Babylon, the Persians. This is the backdrop for the story of Esther, our second portrait, the Jewish girl who became a Persian queen. Her story is an unlikely one. Like Joseph, she finds herself thrust from obscurity into royalty almost by dumb luck. And one day the king is hanging out with his friends and they're all drinking, and he decides that he wants to call Queen Vashti, his queen, out to display her beauty to all of them. And she refuses to show up to court. And so he deposes her. And then in one of the great overreactions of history, he issues a decree into all the land that women have to listen to their men or else. Come on, dude. And so he issues this decree, and this is the backdrop for Esther. It means that her story is not just an unlikely one, it's a dangerous one. Make no mistake, her title may be queen, but she is there to be a trophy for the king. She may be in the halls of power, but she has no power of her own. And that's a big deal, because the villain in this story is a man named Haman. And Haman has a grudge against Esther's cousin, a guy named Mordecai. And Haman hates Mordecai so much that he decides one day to go to the king, who we know is prone to overreact, and ask him to issue a decree that all of the Jews in the region should be put to death. And the king listens to him. So naturally, Mordecai is freaking out. And he goes to Esther, to his one connection, to his one opportunity, it seems, out of this situation, and he pleads with her. Before I tell you what happens next, let me just stop and ask you the question. What would you do in Esther's situation? Here you are in exile. You've been in exile for generations. No reasonable expectation that things will ever change. No reasonable expectation that you will ever see your homeland again. What if this is as good as it gets? What if, by a stroke of unbelievable luck, you have now found yourself in a station beyond your wildest imagination? Shouldn't you just go along to get along? Shouldn't you just blend in and adapt, make the best of your new circumstances? Who cares? I can't control what happens to all of those people out there. I just need to do what's best for me. Why risk everything? Mordecai says this to Esther through her servant. And Hatak came and told Mordecai's words to Esther. This is Esther chapter 4. And Esther said to Hatak and charged him to convey to Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know, we all know this, that every man and woman who comes to the inner court without having been called first, the single rule is to put them to death, unless the king reach out to him the golden scepter. And as for me, I have not been called to come and see the king for 30 days now. He's not interested in seeing me. Mordecai responds, do not imagine, he says to Esther, of all the Jews in the house of the king, that you will escape. For if you indeed remain silent, relief and rescue will come to the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether for just a time like this you have attained royalty. It's kind of interesting. Esther is the only book in the entire Bible where God is never mentioned by name, not once. But that's not because he's absent from the story. Nowhere is that more evident than here in Mordecai's speech. You see, Mordecai sees himself as a person in the middle of a story that is bigger than his own that hasn't resolved yet. He knows enough to recognize it doesn't matter how it looks for me right now. It doesn't matter how it looks for our people right now. I'm part of something bigger than myself. I know where the story is going. I know how it ends, even if I don't know how we get there. And notice he doesn't say to Esther, hey, you're overreacting. The king doesn't care. That rule's dumb. You're going to be fine. He doesn't tell her that. Instead, he looks at her and he says, it's worth the risk. Esther, it's worth it. You have an opportunity to play a role in a story that is so much bigger than your own. Don't miss it. What a powerful perspective that is, right? And Esther responds this way. Go assemble all the Jews, she said, who are in Shushan, and fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink 3 days, night and day. And I too with my young women, we shall fast in this fashion. And so I shall come to the king, not according to the rule. And you know what? If I perish, I perish. And Mordecai moved on and did all that Esther had charged him. And there you go. Spoiler alert for the story. Esther goes to the king. She is granted an audience. She saves God's people. And we are talking about her today, thousands of years later. What an amazing story. All right, how you guys doing? You doing okay? We've got one more portrait, and this one's an easy one. We're going to talk about the Apostle Paul. Very familiar to all of us, wrote most of our New Testament, but what I want to do is actually just jump right into something he says in Philippians chapter 3, and I'll interject as we go along. This is the Apostle Paul writing. He says, watch out for the dogs. Watch out for the bad works people. Watch out for the incision party. That is the mutilators. We are the circumcision, you see. We who worship God by the Spirit and boast in King Jesus and refuse to trust in the flesh. And man, that's a really weird thing to say, Paul, without any context, isn't it? So here's the context. Paul has been going around for the last few years around the Roman Empire, telling people that they can belong to God's family. You can be adopted into God's family, and all you have to do is put your faith and trust and allegiance in Jesus, who is Lord. But there's another group of Jewish Christians, and they're going around often behind Paul to these communities, and they're saying, hey, Jesus is great. Jesus is awesome. He's the Messiah. You put your faith in him. All that's good. But if you really want to belong to God's special family, you need to obey the laws of the Torah. Your men, they need to be circumcised. That's how you know if you belong in God's family. And again, to all of us, this conversation, it just seems so strange, doesn't it? But don't miss the big question that's going underneath all of this. And it's this question. How do I really know if I belong to God's family? That's an important question. Is it how do we really know if we belong to God's family? Is it faith in Jesus or is it something else? And so the Apostle Paul, he continues on. He says this, mind you, I've got good reason to trust in the flesh. If anyone else thinks that they have a reason to trust in the flesh, I've got more. Circumcised on the 8th day. Race, Israelite. Tribe, Benjamin. Descent, Hebrew through and through. Torah observant, I was the most observant. I was a Pharisee. Zealous, I was so zealous I persecuted the church. Official status under the law, blameless. Paul's saying, if you want to talk about the old system, I was the best of the best. Nobody was more successful in that system than me. And yet here it is, Paul, of all people, is now telling us that that system doesn't matter? What? That doesn't make much sense. Paul continues on. Does this sound as though my account was well in credit? Maybe. But whatever I had written in on the profit side, I calculated it instead as a loss because of the Messiah. Yes, I know that's weird, but there's more. I calculate everything as a loss because knowing King Jesus as my Lord is worth far more than everything else put together. In fact, because of the Messiah, I have suffered the loss of everything. And I now calculate it as trash, so that my profit may be in the Messiah, and that I may be discovered in him, not having my own covenant status defined by Torah, but the status which comes through the Messiah's faithfulness, the covenant status from God which is given to faith. What does that mean, Paul? This means knowing him, knowing the power of his resurrection, and knowing the partnership of his sufferings. It means sharing the form and pattern of his death so that somehow I may arrive at the final resurrection from the dead. For Paul, the only thing that seems to matter now is further up and further in to life with God through faith in Jesus by the power of the Spirit. And Paul's saying, that suffering that I'm enduring now, that hardship, I can take that on board too. Jesus suffered before his resurrection as well. And so whatever it takes to be more like Jesus, that's what I want. That's actually all that I want. Paul continues. He says, I'm not implying that I've already received resurrection or that I'm already complete and mature. I've still got work to do just like everybody else. I'm hurrying on though, eager to overtake it because King Jesus has overtaken me. My dear family, I don't reckon that I have yet overtaken it, but this is my one aim, to forget everything that's behind and to strain every nerve to go after what's ahead. I mean to chase on towards the finishing post, where the prize waiting for me is the upward call of God in King Jesus. And then Paul says this, I love it. Those of us who are mature, we should think like this. And if you think differently about it, if you're not there yet, that's okay. God will reveal that to you as well. So there you go. 3 very different portraits of life with God. Very different moments in history, very different stories as they unfold. And as I said at the beginning, the point is not to hold these portraits up so that you can go out and do what they did. The point is so that we can see how they think, how they live, and gain wisdom for our own journey. And I think that when we look at them, there's a lot of wisdom to be gained. Joseph, you see, he didn't end up telling the story that he would have written from himself at the beginning. Not even close. And yet in the end, he is somehow able to see that it was through all of his adversity that God transformed him into the kind of person who can play a big role in God's story. It's amazing. Esther, she could have lived her best life. She had a chance to tell her story as if it's the only one that matters. But in the end, when given the choice, she decided that that wouldn't be a story worth telling. God's story is so much bigger, so much better, and I have a part to play in it. Talk about Paul. Paul could have had a very different life. You understand that within his cultural context, nobody was more successful. Nobody was more well-respected than Paul. And yet he chose a different path for himself. One that meant embracing hardship and suffering occasionally so that he could help other people discover what he had found in Jesus. And what I'm trying to say to you is if you want to begin to understand what life at stage 5 of the critical journey looks like, I think we would do well to meditate on examples like these, just like these. Another way to begin to understand life at stage 5 is actually to begin to look around at the people in this church family, in this community, who just seem to radiate the experience of life with God over a long period of time. You find those people, you get around them and learn to live how they lived. Those people like that they're all around us. On the surface, their lives may look like everybody else, but that's only because some things are just really hard to explain. Some things have to be experienced. These kinds of people, they just seem to live with this deep and abiding sense that they belong in God's story, that they have a part to play in that story. They just seem to know who they are and what they are called to do in God's kingdom. These are the kinds of people who, through their experiences, the highs and the lows, the process of falling apart and being put back together again, they just seem to have learned how to turn all of life into a formative advantage, drawing them deeper into life with God and into love for other people than they ever would have imagined for themselves when they began their journey. I don't know how else to explain it. I don't know how else to explain it when somebody who could just live for themselves decides instead that they're going to live for other people, that they're going to be generous with their time and their talents and their treasures to help others. I don't know how else to explain it when someone uses the pain that they've experienced in their life as a catalyst to move them in the direction of other people. When people who have experienced the worst things that we could imagine, they somehow use that as fuel to go and love and serve people who are going through the same things. I don't know how else to explain it when people show up here like they did last week. People who are busy just like you and me, they show up here and they pack 200 love boxes that are going to go out to young women who are going through an unexpected or crisis pregnancy. I don't know how else to explain it when people show up like they will this weekend. When they could be doing anything else with their weekend, they're going to show up here this weekend and love and serve foster families and the kids that those families are loving and serving. I don't know how to explain the countless stories I hear all the time in this community of people who just keep saying yes, keep dying to themselves, keep giving their lives away. I don't know how to explain it other than to say some people have just experienced life with God over a long period of time. And he has changed them. And you know, I may not be able to explain those kinds of people to you, but here's what I'm absolutely certain of. You could become that kind of a person. You could become that kind of a person. God has that in mind for you. Don't ever underestimate how much your life can be changed the longer you experience it with God. The longer you keep saying yes to Jesus. The longer you keep letting the Spirit of God work in and through your life. Further up, further in, one day at a time, for a lifetime. That's the invitation. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we are grateful. Who in all of the world is as blessed as us who get to gather in this place and sing praises to the God of the universe because we know you and because we are known by you? Who else gets to gaze at portraits throughout history of the unexpected and improbable ways that you show up in people's lives and use them to accomplish your purposes? God, thank you for these portraits that we've seen today, not just in the scriptures and throughout history, but in our own church community. The people who spur us on to greater things, to deeper life with you, the people who challenge us to want more, to give more of ourselves away. God, I don't know where everybody in this room is in their relationship with you right now in their faith journey. So I just pray that you would give them wisdom to know what to do with this. God, wherever they are, that they would wake up tomorrow and just keep saying yes. Keep letting you change them. Keep letting you use them. And let us all be surprised at how radically different we are by the time we get to the end. It is in the name of Jesus I pray all of these things.